A lot of people talk about conspiracies over a shadow government. I'm willing to testify before Congress that these black operations do exist. I nearly became part of it. But I saw the light, I think. Or was it? And I got out. And that's it. We have to disclose what we know. And I am willing to testify before Congress under oath, or before any other organization, that what I witnessed was true.
Okay, so that was John Maynard talking in the introductory video clip there. In this presentation we're going to ask some basic questions to start off with. What is gravity? What is anti-gravity? What evidence is there that technology, other than conventional aerospace technology, exists, which could be thought of as being anti-gravity or something attempting to control gravity? And we will look at some history of anti-gravity research, some of the research of Nick Cook, which also includes the history of anti-gravity research, or some of it anyway, the Hutchison Effect, some anti-gravity experiments, a place called Coral Castle in Florida, alleged black projects in the USA, which you heard a modicum about in the introductory video clip. We'll also mention the sightings of flying triangles in the USA and in other countries. One of the other things which I came across was possible hints of new technology which have come from NASA, which was quite interesting. This was last February 2004. Okay, so we start off by asking, what is gravity? Newtonian theory says gravity is the force of attraction that arises between objects by virtue of their masses, and this definition comes from the Chambers English Dictionary, CD-ROM edition, 1996. And here we have a picture of Isaac Newton with the equation which he expressed that idea. The force of gravity obeys an inverse square law. At twice a given distance, the force is only 1/4 as strong. That's basically what it says. Of course, the famous story is he came up with this theory when an apple from an apple tree fell on his head. And he came up with that theory in the 17th century, and it stayed as the main theory of gravity until around 1905, when Einstein came along with his theory of relativity, and he redefined what gravity was. Now, he observed that a planet's orbit around the Sun, as observed in three-dimensional space, arises from its natural trajectory in modified space-time. There is no need for a force of gravity coming from the Sun and acting on the planet. This explains oddities in the orbit of Mercury, the precession of the perihelion, not explained by Newtonian gravitation. And this is from the Hutchinson's Concise Encyclopedia, CD-ROM edition, 1996. So what he basically said is you don't need a force of gravity as such. The force arises because of the geometry of space-time. And this was effectively proved, but from a certain point of view, when observers noted the orbit of Mercury, in that if you observe the orbit of Mercury, it will should be in a given position 88 days. In fact, it should be in the same position in the sky 88 days after the previous time you observed it. However, there is actually a very small discrepancy which amounts to an orbital distance of something like about 10 miles. And so this is the precession of the perihelion. It moves around. The closest point to the Sun actually moves in its orbit at 43 arcseconds per century. That's the figure. So it's a very keenly observed fact, this. And this is basically explained in Einstein's theory by saying that, well, okay, the mass of the Sun is so big, you can calculate that based on Newtonian mechanics, but the Sun is actually also an energetic object. It gives off a lot of radiation in the form of light, ultraviolet, heat, etc. And this large volume of radiation which is given off, the Sun is losing mass at the rate of 4 billion tonnes a second, let's not forget. That means the energy given off acts like an extra bit of mass which we can't actually see, but nevertheless you have to do the Newtonian calculation with the mass energy product effectively. That's what Einstein said. And that's how come you get this discrepancy. And there's been other apparent confirmations of Newton's theories as well. So what is gravity? Again, let's look at the most recent theory, which is called string theory. And this is an attempt to develop a theory to account for the problems encountered in reconciling quantum mechanics, which is the physics of the infinitesimally small, and general relativity, which is the physics of the cosmologically large. String theory, or M theory, says that the force of gravity is transmitted by gravitons, the particle that causes gravity. So again, we're back to this idea of a force, and how is that force transmitted from to make it influence matter? Well, the string theory says that it's to do with particles or strings which make up our reality, and that's how this thing is transmitted. There are 5 different versions of string theory, 5 different formulations, and the latest of which works in 11 dimensions, and these are mathematical dimensions, which supposedly show the existence of non-physical dimensions which these forces connect in. It is probably unrelated, but another presentation I do is about somebody called Wilbert Smith, and he was a Canadian radio engineer, and he was told by people from outside that there are 12 dimensions of deity, so it almost ties in with the 11 of string theory. We'll talk a little bit more about Wilbert Smith later, but for now, to explain a bit more about the string theory, here's Professor Brian Greene of Columbia University.
It's been more than 300 years since Isaac Newton came up with the universal law of gravity, inspired, as the story goes, by seeing an apple fall from a tree. Today it seems obvious that gravity is a powerful force.
It would seem to most people that gravity is a very important force. It's very strong. It's very hard to get up in the morning, stand up, and when things fall, they break because gravity is strong. The fact of the matter is that it's not strong. It's really a very weak force.
Gravity pulls us down to the Earth and keeps our Earth in orbit around the Sun. But in fact, we overcome the force of gravity all the time. It's not that hard. Even with the gravity of the entire Earth pulling this apple downward, the muscles in my arm can easily overcome it. And it's not just our muscles that put gravity to shame. Magnets can do it too. No sweat. Magnets carry a different force, the electromagnetic force. That's the same force behind light and electricity. It turns out that electromagnetism is much, much stronger than gravity. Gravity, in comparison, is amazingly weak. How weak? The electromagnetic force is some 1,000 billion, 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 billion times stronger. That's a 1 with 39 zeros following it. The weakness of gravity has confounded scientists for decades. But now, With the radical world of string theory, filled with membranes and extra dimensions, there's a whole new way to look at the problem.
One way of approaching the question of why gravity is so weak compared to all the other forces is to turn the question completely on its head and say, no, actually gravity isn't very weak compared to all the other forces. It just appears to be weak.
It may be that gravity is actually just as strong as electromagnetism, but for some reason, we can't feel its strength.
Consider a pool table, a very large pool table. Think of the surface of the pool table as representing our three-dimensional universe, although it is just two-dimensional. And think of the billiard balls as representing atoms and other particles that the universe is made out of.
So here's the wild idea. The atoms and particles that make up stuff in the world around us will stay on our particular membrane, our slice of the universe, just as the billiard balls will stay on the surface of the pool table. Unless you're a really bad pool player. But whenever the balls collide, there is something that always seeps off the table. Sound waves. That's why I can hear the collision. Now, the idea is that gravity might be like the sound waves. It might not be confined to our membrane. It might be able to seep off our part of the universe. Or, think about it another way. Instead of pool tables, let's go back to bread. Imagine that our universe is like this slice of toast, and that you and me and all of matter, light itself, everything we see is like jelly. Now, jelly can move freely on the surface of the toast, but otherwise it's stuck. It can't leave the surface itself. But what if gravity were different? What if gravity were more like cinnamon and sugar? Now, this stuff isn't sticky at all, so it easily slides right off the surface. But why would gravity be so different from everything else that we know of in the universe? Well, it turns out that string theory, or M theory, provides an answer. It all has to do with shape. For years, we concentrated on strings that were closed loops, like rubber bands. But after M theory, we turned our attention to other kinds. Now we think that everything we see around us, like matter and light, is made of open-ended strings. And the ends of each string are tied down to our three-dimensional membrane. But closed loops of string do exist. And one kind is responsible for gravity. It's called a graviton. With closed loops, there are no loose ends to tie down, so gravitons are free to escape into the other dimensions, diluting the strength of gravity and making it seem weaker than the other forces of nature. This suggests an intriguing possibility. If we do live on a membrane, and there are parallel universes on other membranes near us, we may never see them. But perhaps we could one day feel them through gravity.
Okay, so that was Professor Brian Greene explaining how string theory explains gravity. To summarise some of what he said, gravity is a weak force in comparison to the other forces of nature. String theory suggests then that gravity may be similar to the other forces in its true nature, quote unquote. Part of its force acts in another dimension, a non-physical dimension. Alternatively, It may be a force leaking from another dimension, a non-physical dimension, into our own. So it's kind of partly an extra-dimensional force, and this is actually what string theory postulates. This could account for it being difficult to measure g, the gravitational constant, accurately. It is given a value of 6.67 times 10 to the minus 11. So g is the figure which is included in the equation on one of the earlier slides that I showed, which you multiply by the masses and then divide by the distance squared to get the force of gravity. Though string theory seems to be the most popular as a way of explaining gravity at the moment, there is another theory which I'd just like to mention in passing called loop quantum gravity, which is another way of trying to use quantum mechanics to explain how the force of gravity arises. So string theory doesn't have everything all its own way. There is a competing theory, but string theory is by far the most popular. But does any of this sound like a good explanation of gravity? How close are we to understanding it? I might suggest the following. Gravity is probably not what we think it is. I'd like to therefore carry on and just make it clear what is not anti-gravity or an anti-gravity device before we move forwards with this topic. A chair is not an anti-gravity device because, by my definition, it simply stops you falling down. A chair is simply a rigid structure which resists the force of gravity. In other words, there's nothing unusual about a chair. You can have a metal rod or you can have a rock. They have the same effect as a chair. Just like the bones in your body, they stop the force of gravity pulling you to the earth. A balloon is not an anti-gravity device. It floats because of mass displacement, which is to do with Archimedes' principle. You remember Archimedes' famous eureka moment when he got in the bath and displaced water. Well, that was him displacing mass, and he realised that he could work out the weight of the king's crown and see whether it was really gold or silver or what have you, or lead or whatever. And this is through the principle of mass displacement. You move mass from one place to another, and this generates lift or thrust. A propeller or jet or rocket engine is not an anti-gravity device. It works by displacing mass from one place to another to generate thrust. With a jet engine, for example, a large volume of air is sucked in at the front of the engine at slow speed, and the same volume of air is ejected out of the back of the engine at high speed, and then you have wings which create the lift. So this is all conventional Newtonian physics, and it's to do with things like fluid flow and Archimedes' principle. It's all conventional physics. Similarly, an ion engine, which some of you may have heard of, that's the latest type of rocket engine, which was used on the Deep Space One probe, and it's also been used on the European Moon probe, which I can't remember the name of at the moment. And this is effectively the same as a rocket engine. It works effectively the same as a rocket engine. This is the ion engine here. And it just displaces mass from one place to another. It's just that you can get a certain number of pounds more thrust from a given mass of propellant than you can from a liquid oxygen and hydrogen engine, which is used in the space shuttle, for example. So none of those are anti-gravity devices. None of them. So if those are not anti-gravity devices, what would I call an anti-gravity device? What is one? Here's some examples, and here's a definition. Any device or method capable of changing the local gravitational field strength or having the effect of reducing an object's weight. No propellant. Essentially what I'm talking about here is a field effect. Something that affects the gravitational field. Doesn't move mass around. Another term might simply be gravity control. Something which is able to control the force of gravity. Maybe even switch it on and off. Now I think all these things are real examples of anti-gravity devices. Devices which can control the force of gravity. We have the Paul Trent's McMinnville saucer from 1950, which is widely regarded as an authentic picture of a craft in the sky. We have the Lifter 1, which I'll talk a bit more about later, and Thomas Townsend Brown's experimental gravitator disk, and we'll talk a little bit more about Thomas Townsend Brown in a short while. So what are the general characteristics of anti-gravity devices and experiments? When working through anti-gravity research, several things seem to recur. We have devices spinning very quickly or having spinning components at high speed. We can feed in high voltages to give us an electrogravitic effect.
Many of these anti-gravitational experiments seem to have a common thread. We have, for example, this guy in Russia called Podkletnov, who's using spinning superconductors. We had the German research, which involves the rapid spinning of a kind of rather weird-shaped turbine to produce an anti-gravity effect. There was another German program I uncovered in southern Poland, which again used spinning. Now, what, of course, these have in common is this spinning factor, which, according to some theorists, say if you spin up this zero-point energy field that exists all around us, some weird and magical things start popping out, one of which is an anti-gravitational effect. As I said before, there's no single pathway to this anti-gravitational effect, but there do seem to be many ways of triggering it. Most seem to involve spinning, and a lot seem to involve the input of high doses of electricity.
We have the use of strong magnetic fields, magnetogravitics, which I'll also mention briefly. And here we have some examples of those things in action, or rather animations of. We have Gordon Cooper's sighting of a craft in 1955, which must use some type of anti-gravity effect. And this was filmed at Edwards Air Force Base. The film, of course, was classified, but Gordon Cooper stated on a 2003 documentary that his team actually did film this object landing on the dry lake bed. We have the microwave propulsion system, which Paul Potter has done a beautiful animation of on his UFO physics website, which is now being sold on CD. Now, anti-gravity research may have even started in the early days of electric power, around 1900. This, of course, is forgetting some of the ancient evidence that this sort of technology may have been in common usage in very ancient times. Now, according to Nick Cook's research, which we'll talk a little bit more about later, there was open discussion of the subject among groups of scientists until about 1956, when it seemed to become the subject of ridicule and/or went underground. And there are many historical, even mythological figures who have supposedly experimented with gravity control. Two prominent names are Nikola Tesla and Thomas Townsend Brown. Nikola Tesla was born in Serbia and emigrated to the USA in 1884. Tesla was mainly a pioneer in the fields of electrostatics and electricity generation, and he actually worked for quite a long time with Thomas Edison. And it was actually Tesla who invented the alternating current-based electricity distribution system that we're using right now. So there are many stories about Tesla. The guy was clearly a genius. In fact, I don't think he was an ordinary genius, to use a term which was coined about Richard Feynman. Tesla was a remarkable person, and his legacy is still today not fully understood, in my opinion. And it was his work which paved the way for similar pioneering work in the field of electrogravitics, which was done by people like Thomas Townsend Brown.
Do you, as a reporter, have any idea whether there was an official follow-up with Mr. Tesla's stuff and how far they got?
Well, I never really followed the Tesla story up in any great depth, but I am aware of the FBI moving in on his apartment when he died.
Yes.
I am aware that they classified a lot of his material.
Yes.
And it seems to me, I mean, when you look at perhaps similar instances of the government moving in to secure knowledge that it doesn't want let out today, we see, as you know, the governments everywhere in the Western world clamping down on proliferating technology they don't want to get into the wrong hands. I find it quite likely that 50-odd years ago, when Tesla died, in fact, he died during the Second World War, a time of particular security concerns, that the government would have stepped in then and gone, we don't want this knowledge getting out. We don't necessarily understand this knowledge, but we do think that what this man Tesla was doing was interesting and perhaps dangerous. And those ideas in the wrong hands could be fatal.
Another of the figures that Nick Cook discusses in his book is Thomas Townsend Brown. Now, he was from Ohio. Townsend never obtained a degree. He spent time studying at several schools, including Caltech, Kenyon College and Denison University. He has been called a physicist. In fact, in this clip, that's what Nick Cook refers to him as. But my impression really was that he was more of an electrical engineer. He was a person who liked to mess about with equipment and build experiments. He wasn't quite so much a theoretician as far as I've been able to work out, although I'm sure he did quite a bit of that as well. He served in the US Navy in the 1930s, and he also went to the Naval Research Laboratory. And some people have suggested that he had kind of an ordinary job in the Navy, and he did secret research as well. He was involved with something called Project Winterhaven, and this was a research proposal which has been released under Freedom of Information, I believe. It is available. Nick Cook discusses it in his book. And this proposal was to build an anti-gravity craft, and it was based on earlier work that Townsend Brown had already completed. Townsend Brown died in California in 1985. Much of his work still is wrapped in secrecy, and his family tend to keep a low public profile. So, you know, it's actually quite hard to get really into the nitty-gritty of Townsend Brown. But there's many people have reproduced some of his experiments, which I'll talk a bit more about later. And so here's Nick Cook to talk a bit about Townsend Brown.
Well, Brown is a very interesting figure. He came from Ohio. He was a physicist. He studied under a protege of Einstein, and he had some pretty unconventional ideas. He came up with this experiment, which showed that if you charge a capacitor, that's a device that retains electrical charge, positively on its upper side and negatively on its underside, this thing will rise. It will rise in the direction of the positive charge.
So let's have a look at some of the things he got up to. He worked with Dr. Paul Biefeld, who was a friend of Albert Einstein, so he was in good company. Biefeld was the director of Swayze Observatory in Denison, Ohio, at the Denison University. In 1923, so this is, you know, a long time ago, we're talking 80 years ago, they started to experiment with what are called gravitators and found an interaction between the electric charge and the force of gravity. And you can see an example of this here, where we have two 44-pound weights which are hung from the ceiling, very long suspensions, I don't know exactly how long, and we have a glass rod between them to sort of just effectively gauge the distance between them. And we have the midpoint grounded, and then we apply an electrical charge as shown here between the two objects of 120 kilovolts, 120,000 volts. And what actually happened is that the direction of movement was always of the entire system towards the positive charge. They discovered this effect of movement towards the positive charge. Okay? Separate to his study of physics, Townsend Brown founded NICAP, which was the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomenon. And in 1956, this was started to serve as a clearinghouse or a listening post for information regarding source of sightings and evidence. So you can see he's directly linked into the UFO phenomenon. He was interested in it. And I've got a quote at the end from Thomas Townsend Brown regarding what he thought about the UFO enigma, as it were. He served for some time as director of NICAP, as did, of course, Major Donald Kehoe. So he kept company with those sorts of people. Townsend Brown has also been linked to the Philadelphia experiment as well, on the periphery of that, but I don't know a lot about that. Townsend Brown worked in the field of what has become known as electrogravitics, which I've already mentioned, the use of electricity to affect gravity. And he patented a number of inventions. In the 1950s, he was still working on this sort of area of technology at the Barnson lab, and you can see here some of the stuff that he worked on. I've got a film clip in a minute of this. Now, just to give you a sample of kind of how he dealt with people who asked him about his anti-gravity work, in response to a letter written to him in 1982, Thomas Townsend Brown wrote to the person who wrote the letter, "I regret to advise you that electrogravitic research has been taken over in its entirety by a Californian corporation, which has imposed secrecy, at least until their investigations are completed." So you can see that he was really keeping mum about this. I mean, that's not surprising really when you consider the type of things he was working on, which was technology presumably for military applications. So a little more about this, became known as the Biefeld-Brown effect. It was originally discovered when they were working with high-voltage X-ray tubes, and they found that when they turned these on and off, these tubes would move excessively as if there was some force applied to them. There didn't seem to be any obvious explanation for this. As you may appreciate, X-ray tubes run at very high voltages, typically above 25 kilovolts. Now, they also discovered that when they charged a capacitor up, they made large capacitors, they actually lost weight. This was one of the key things. It actually lost weight. You could charge a capacitor up, and it was lighter than when it was discharged. And I've got actually a video of this shortly. Biefeld set Brown to work on the phenomenon. He found this very interesting, and so he set Thomas Townsend Brown on working with this. Nick Cook discusses Thomas Townsend Brown and the Biefeld-Brown effect to a small degree in his book The Hunt for Zero Point. Nick Cook is a journalist, and he was a former editor of Jane's Defence Weekly, and he became intrigued when someone sent him an article about anti-gravity research. He tried to follow up a contact who was called George S. Trimble, whom he had read had worked in the field of anti-gravity research in the 50s. He'd worked on some of these projects. Trimble initially agreed to be interviewed for Nick Cook's book, but then withdrew suddenly. He was reportedly scared, and Nick Cook got this through one of his contacts in the defence industry. This is all in Nick Cook's book, Cook continued his research quietly over 10 years and journeyed some way into the black world of defence research during World War II. So he's got quite a bit on this. And he's not the first person to research this sort of stuff. I mean, people have been saying that the Nazis worked on back-engineered stuff and all kinds of things in the years of the Second World War. But Nick sort of expands on this a little bit in some areas. Now, the book, The Hunt for Zero Point, is the story of Nick's 10-year journey into all this research, which he conducted in his spare time. So here's Nick to talk a little bit more about that.
About the 1950s research in the US was that just about every aerospace company you've ever heard of was involved in the field. In 1955, a range of companies like Lockheed, Convair, Bell, these big names from the US aerospace industry from the time, were all talking about, this coming revolution, the anti-gravity revolution, and that all they needed was some input from the US government in terms of support and funding, and they could crack the science. And to me, what was intriguing was that there was an echo here of what was happening, or what had been happening, in the pre-Second World War years with fission, with atomic science, where the community was very much divided. You had those saying that if you split an atom, you could get an enormous release of energy, enough perhaps to make a bomb, and those within the field, physicists working within the field, who said it's absolutely impossible. And of course, in the mid-1950s, where these guys were talking about anti-gravity research in the same light, the community was riven with the same kind of dissents, those who said it was possible and those who said it was impossible. So there is this kind of intriguing echo, and again, that gave me some confidence that it was worth pursuing, because we know now the terrible consequences of the atomic bomb.
One of the people which Nick talks about in his book is a very strange person by the name of Hans Kammler. Kammler was an officer in the SS, and he was put in charge of secret projects to develop advanced technology for the Nazis. And if you look at the way they actually did this, they did exactly the same as what they've done in the US. In other words, they set up a state within a state, a compartmentalized system whereby research was done and results were only known by those who were in the loop. Even top military brass were kept from the knowledge of this research. So here Nick Cook talks a little bit more about Hans Kammler.
So little is known about him, and yet he was one of the most senior individuals outside of the German cabinet, Hitler's inner circle, during the Second World War. His mandate towards the end of the war was to amass all the high technology that Germany produced during the war, and not only develop it. I mean, for instance, the V1 and V2 missiles and rockets that were developed and fired on the Low Countries and on England during the war were under his control at the end of the war. But the most fascinating aspect for me was that Kammler set up a secret research cell in Czechoslovakia, which was ring-fenced even from other high-ranking Germans. And within this research cell, he went beyond. He authorized research into weapons beyond the V1 and the V2, which in themselves were highly advanced and, of course, became the basis of the rocket program that took Americans to the moon. So Kammler was this mercurial, incredibly unpleasant bureaucrat who had his hands into the architecture of the death camps, for example. But he also took over the German secret weapons as well. And, of course, it's significant that at the end of the war, he disappeared off the face of the earth.
He built the largest underground facility in the world, built by concentration camp prisoners, to work on these weapons. And you went there. It's in the Harz Mountains.
Yeah.
What's it like?
the Mittelwerk is a huge underground facility. It's still there. You can go and see it. It was built to construct the V-2 rockets and other weapon systems, and it was put underground so that U.S. and U.K. British strategic bombing during the war couldn't touch it. Well, the plant that Kamler oversaw, it was held. It was actually a sectioned off site of something called the Skoda Works in Czechoslovakia. It was designated to be overtaken by the Russians. It was in the Russians' designated zone of influence at the end of the war. What is interesting, though, is that Patton's army, right at the end of the war, in early May, swept in and overtook the Skoda Works for a brief period of time before the Russians got there. Now, what evidence there is suggests that Kamler got a lot of his research out. We don't know where that research went. Some of it may well have gone to Russia. Some of it may well have gone to the United States. The intriguing aspect is we don't know what happened to Kamler. There are 4 conflicting accounts of his death. None of them stand up to scrutiny. This was the most influential and most important guy at the end of the Second World War, who had all Germany's secret weapons research at his disposal. And somebody like that, of course, would have had a great bargaining chip to deal with any of the victors, the victorious allies that he cared to have chosen to deal with, to bargain for his life, because Kamler needed to bargain for his life. He was the man who helped to build up the death camps. He had a bureaucratic vision for how the death camps should be created. He was if you like, an architect, one of the architects of the Holocaust. So he needed very firmly to bargain for his life, and this would have been a definite bargaining chip, all this high technology.
Another branch of research which Nick undertook was into the work of Victor Schauberger, who came up with this device which he called a repulsine. And this was an over-unity implosion device where it would spin at very, very high speed and have water sucked into it. And once it reached a particular speed, you would get this implosive effect. And Schauberger reported that this actually lifted off during testing. And Nick Cook went to see his family and looked at the chap's notes and work. He was given money to develop this experiment, so it was apparently not just some harebrained scheme again, which is the way that these things are often looked at. One of the experiments that Nick Cook also found was something called the Bell, and this was conducted in a mine in what is now Poland. And this again was some kind of experiment to spin components at high speed and some kind of rotating bell, and it would have this effect when switched on and rotated at high speed of giving off light, a blue light, and apparently influencing the space-time field. And this seems to be a recurrent theme, and such experiments are often said to produce anomalous energy or field effects, much like those observed near flying saucers. And you'll hear, when we talk about the lifters, some of the odd effects which people have witnessed with those when running them for long periods. So here's Nick Cook to tell us a little bit more.
I was aided by a Polish researcher who had heard that I was interested in this area, and he got in contact with me and said that there was this guy had been researching German secret weapons technology in Poland, modern-day Poland, but southwest Poland today was Lower Silesia of Germany in the Second World War.
Right.
And he had uncovered a rat run of underground complexes where the Germans were working on some very advanced stuff. And one of them, he felt, fitted the bill for an anti-gravity experiment. It took place in a mine the experiment took place in a deep mine in Poland and consisted of this device called the bell, which was rotated at very high speed, and when rotated gave off this kind of ionization type glow. And
like a plasma, you mean?
Yeah, it was described like a kind of a bluish, purplish kind of glow, like a plasma type glow, but it's really described as a sort of an ionization type effect. But this experiment, no one knew, or at least this researcher, Witkowski, this chap who was helping me, he didn't know what this experiment was about. But he'd taken it apart based on court testimony that was given to the Polish courts in a war trial, in a war crimes trial. And it very much appears as if this was an experiment to distort space and time. When you distort space and time, you start to get weird and wonderful phenomena pop out of the environment, as I know John Hutchinson will tell you. And this was clearly some very early experiments done by the Germans in 1945 to try and generate some kind of anti-gravitational effect.
This would have been the Wenceslaw mine?
Yeah, absolutely. The experiment was known as the Bell. The device was known as the Bell, but it was in this Wenceslaw mine in southwest Poland today. Yeah, and I visited the site.
Now, yet another figure who conducted anti-gravity experiments was someone called Wilbert Smith, who I've talked about in a separate presentation. He was a very, very interesting person. And Wilbert Smith became the superintendent of radio regulations in Canada. And he postulated in simple terms that the force of gravity was actually the result of interacting magnetic fields that objects themselves generated. And he didn't go off into the realms of string theory or relativity. He believed that Einstein was wrong, and gravity arose as an effect of magnetism. He suggested that a motional magnetic field might be used to influence gravity, and he and his team designed experiments to test this. Now, when you look at Wilbert Smith and what he did, he was responsible, for example, for setting up the wartime radio monitoring network in Canada, which was used by Canadian intelligence operatives to deliver their reports over the airwaves to the Canadian government. So this guy he wasn't some guy working in a shed. This guy, he was a top guy. And if you do some research into Wilbert Smith, you'll find it a pretty extraordinary story. And by my reckoning, there is no reason at all to assume that he was deluded or lying. He was telling the truth, and what he said he did, and the results that he interpreted them correctly as far as I am concerned.
Able to go into the laboratory and conduct a series of experiments which proved beyond a doubt that this is true. Our laboratory experiments have allowed us to make about a 1% change in the weight of objects. We can make them about 1% heavier or 1% lighter. Now that is a long way from holding a spacecraft up, because we have to go over 100% in order to do that. But the fact that we can do it, the fact that the principles which these people from outside gave us and guided us to finding out for ourselves, are valid, certainly indicates that, first, these people are what they say they are. Second, that their technology is what they say it is, that it is superior to ours, that ours is inadequate in many respects.
Looking at more modern times, one of the things which Nick Cook discussed in his book was research at Lockheed Martin, which is, of course, the big aircraft company. Now, some people seem to dismiss the idea that anti-gravity technology has been researched at all by US defence companies or the Air Force. But in a 1999 documentary broadcast on Channel 5 here in the UK, Boyd Bushman confirmed their research, and he's done this repeatedly. Boyd Bushman has also appeared to confirm that this research has produced results. In other words, they haven't just been fiddling about with nothing and getting nothing from it. They've actually got results. Okay, and he's gone on record as saying that, as you'll see in a moment. Now, Nick Cook spoke to him, I guess, in about 1998.
Perhaps the person who took me closest to believing in things I'd normally have thought were impossible was Boyd Bushman. He is a senior scientist for Lockheed Martin, the world's biggest defense contractor. In the quest for breakthroughs in aircraft propulsion, it was Bushman's job to think beyond the frontiers of what is known and understood. Doing what he did, I strongly suspected that he lived on the fringes of the black world. Perhaps nervous of what he could and couldn't say, he certainly seemed to talk in riddles.
I believe that nature does not speak English. What nature tells us is what must be honored. It has been talking to us in many domains, and we have data sets that we're still trying to understand. But I can't talk to all the theoreticians because there don't exist theories where I am. What we have is wonderful, and it comes from miracles occurring. But that we will see will not be what we have. And I therefore tell my team, if you know anything, I really don't want to talk to you, because everything we know has already gone to production. Now, if there's something you kind of wonder, or if you think of, etc., let's take those steps to the future. And that's what we always have to do, is walk literally. Kind of a lonely walk, but a very, very rewarding walk, to listen where languages are not taught and verbalization is not used, but we have to learn its language.
I felt he was trying to tell me something he wasn't allowed to talk about. So I asked him about the holy grail of science fiction, anti-gravity propulsion.
I do notice in recent publications that one of the latest group of my colleagues have said that they have evidence, because of the separation of the galaxies, that there is an anti-gravity. I went back to some of the first work on gravity done by Galileo, and he climbed his Leaning Tower of Pisa and dropped 2 stones. They arrived at the ground at the same time. I climbed my Leaning Tower of Building 500 here at the company, and I dropped my 2 weights that were exactly the same weight, and they did not arrive at the ground at the same time. I had purposely placed opposing magnets that didn't like each other, like 2 norths together, and I had already done an iron filing test that showed that it was showering out an entire magnetic plane, and I wanted to see how that magnetic plane interfaced with gravity.
He showed me a film of extraordinary experiments that had been done in Canada 10 years ago. A scientist there appeared to have found a way of getting objects to defy gravity by beaming different energy waves at them. Most people had written it off as a conjuring trick, but Bushman took it seriously and was trying to develop his own techniques.
I'm refining and heading towards something that all you have to do is charge, and it is lifting up. It is losing weight. When we complete the technology, it should fly.
I was astounded that someone of Bushman's standing should seriously discuss the notion of anti-gravity with me. His experimental work opened up a world of possibilities that for me has made the unbelievable believable.
Now, from that video clip, we can see that Bushman's words were, "What we have is wonderful, and it comes from miracles occurring, but that we will see is not what we have." And then he also said, "I am refining and heading towards something that all you have to do is charge it, and it is lifting up. It is losing weight. When we complete the technology, it should fly." Now, you can take it that he's just been messing about and they've never really produced any results, and what he says, they've never actually sort of completed anything. Or you can take the view that yes, in fact, the results have been successful and they've simply been kept under wraps, or largely. Now, when I've discussed this with somebody a while ago, who was very interested in this sort of thing, he suggested to me the following equation may give an answer to what has been produced by this research. Now, if you look at the work of Tesla and Thomas Townsend Brown, and you plug that into the military, and you realise that they've basically had almost unlimited tax dollars to spend on these black projects, I think that is what they've come up with. So now we're going to look at some simple anti-gravity experiments which, if you have fairly basic equipment and skills, you can make yourself. And this actually seems to be an example of the Biefeld-Brown effect in action.
So they are speaking. I am glad to show you an electrogravitic experiment. Here, this is a high voltage power supply set to deliver about 10 kilovolts. Here, you have a high sensitive electrogravitic balance, and the voltage is sent through the balance to this T-shaped craft. This experiment is based on the Alexander Frolov hat device. Now, I send the high voltage to the electrogravitic device. You will notice that the system shows a wave loss during the high voltage on the system. Now, I switch off the high voltage, and the capacitor remains charged. And during the discharge, you will notice that the balance gets refined its equilibrium at the end of the experiment.
Now, what he actually made there was a capacitor weighing balance, and this can be made from fairly simple materials. All you need is some polystyrene, some copper wire, some aluminium foil, and you can see some foam there, some insulating foam. You can make this out of a polystyrene tile, and you need a sort of Stanley knife and whatnot. And you can try this yourself. It's not difficult. It's a simple experiment. Now, to show a bit more clearly what was on the previous slide, we can show it in diagrammatic form. And we see here, for example, we have this what's called the Frolov's hat, which is basically a capacitor. That's what it turns out to be. We have polystyrene here, an aluminium plate, and we have some aluminium in the middle. Obviously, the polystyrene insulates this plate from that one. We have a positive wire, which goes down to the plus of the 10 kilovolt supply, and a negative wire coming from the outside. Very simple. I mean, you can construct this quite easily as long as you can cut the polystyrene well without making too many mistakes, and you can use a bit of glue, etc. Very, very easy to make. And you can see that, simply speaking, when the voltage is applied, the capacitor moves up, the hat moves up. So what causes that? Why should that happen? Well, it's because the thing is changing weight. It's getting lighter. Okay? Now, some people say that this is because of what's called an ion wind. In other words, there is a flow of electrons from the positive electrode to the negative electrode, which is effectively generating thrust by mass displacement. But it seems to me that if you look at the arrangement of the two plates, in that experiment, the ions should be travelling from, if I go back to the previous slide, the ions should be travelling from here to here. That is not a vertical motion. The ions should be travelling from there to there. That is a sideways motion. So how can that possibly, a sideways motion, make this thing go up? The second reason why I don't think it's an ion wind effect is if you put this thing inside a plastic bag, as he has done here, you also get the same effect. It still rises. So that to me says that that is not an ion wind effect. So many scientists say that there is no electrogravitic effect. Electricity does not affect gravity. It is a byproduct of air ionisation or an ion wind. Well, I don't agree with that explanation. And if you make further calculations, it appears to show, if you look at Jean-Louis Nardin's website, the ion wind effect seems to be approximately 10,000 times too weak to explain the amount of movement in these experiments, to explain the amount of lift and thrust that is produced. Now, with the first one, when the electric balance is switched off, the ion wind should cease when the power is switched off. But the balance levels as the capacitor discharges, so I'm going to show that again. It is also fairly easy to build a lifter.
Hi, this is Jean Inodin speaking. This is the test number 2 of the lifter Maximus 2. Now, I switch on the power supply. I switch on the power supply.
The next evidence for antigravity that I want to look at is the Hutchison effect. The Hutchison effect was seen in the clip with Nick Cook and Boyd Bushman. Some people say it's just a cheap fraud. I don't think so. Bushman hinted to Nick Cook that he should take a trip to Vancouver to see John Hutchison, and this is the person who did the tricks in the video. Hutchison claims to produce this effect, an anti-gravity effect that is, with only about 400 watts of power. That's the same as 4 light bulbs worth of power. Now, one of the things which he found when he had this equipment set up was that he couldn't reproduce it on demand. His apparatus only seemed to work about 10% of the time, so he could set it all up identically and switch it on and nothing would happen, and then other times he would switch it all on and he would get the effect. And he would even have effects which manifested themselves after he'd switched the equipment off. He seemed to get things which happened to do with time, which we'll hear a little bit more about in a second.
One of the things that surprised me somewhat is, and it was something I didn't notice at first, the lifters do seem to have side effects, and it's one of those things that very few people like to report. We did testing with a shielded magnetometer, and we were unable to pick up the Earth's magnetic field while the lifter was operating, and we also had some unexplained signals in the background. And it's one of those things where when you mention it online, reports start pouring in from people all over the world saying, you know, I had this happen and I can't really explain it. It's not really something that happens all the time. You know, another thing that I had happen, interestingly, was I've had sparks that appear out of nowhere. And in a way, they're almost not really bound in time at all. When I operate the lifter consistently for several days on end, I can turn it off, but there's a period of a week or so where I'll get unexplained electromagnetic effects. You know, and they're uncommon enough and they're random enough that there's no really way to pin them down. But I've wondered if maybe, you know, with on a much smaller power scale, if lifters might tie into some of the same effects that you've seen.
Oh, I would definitely say they do in some areas. Wouldn't be surprised sometimes somebody's going to discover something happening somewhere else. And when you mentioned about the energy in that too, remember when the lab was turned off, our main lab, that we always had test equipment. So I turned on a spectrum analyzer, and good heavens, it seemed to be a source of energy still there, and it slowly dissipated over a half hour. And I know that all the main plasma capacitors were discharged and everything else was rested. And I was just scratching my head over that one. Sorry.
Oh, it's interesting that you mentioned that. One of the things that I usually don't like to talk about was when we had the magnetometer we were testing, the Earth's magnetic field didn't appear, and this was in about a 12-foot radius, I think, for about 15 minutes after we turned the lifter off. And we had done the same thing. We walked away scratching our heads. We tested it 3 or 4 times. We would run the lifter for about 5-10 minutes and turn it off, and there were no static effects in the area. I have very good discharge equipment, and I have a good discharge probe, and everything was shut down, cold. I was actually working on the lifter one of the times, repositioning it, so there was no residual that I could tell. But at the same time, about 15 minutes later, the magnetometer would start beeping again, and the beeping indicated that it could detect the Earth's magnetic field. The strange thing was, this thing was between 6 and 8 feet away from the lifter, and we tested in a variety of positions, and we just couldn't pin down what it would be. It didn't seem to be static because, again, it was meant for high voltage experiments. It was shielded against static. Although at the same time, it's not impossible that it could have been effective.
The other effects that he saw were the melting and fusion of metals, where he'd get metal which seemed to have disintegrated. And he had situations where he had wood and metal fused together at a molecular or even atomic level. This was really strange. And he sent samples of this to various places as well. I haven't seen any personally, but he had some pretty weird effects. And you can see in the picture, he's got this effect of melting in the middle. And it's a very strange effect. Very strange. So this is real physical evidence. John Hutchison's lab equipment was confiscated on the 24th of February 1990 by the direct order of former Canadian Prime Minister Brian Mulroney. The government has retained the lab in spite of a court order by Judge Paris of the Supreme Court of British Columbia to return it. So they actually confiscated the lab. Why? If he was a fraud, and this was some fraudulent experiment which he had made up, why did they confiscate the lab? And this was front page news
at the time, and I was invited by Germany and Austria to go over there and study the Hutchison Effect with all the lab equipment. So when I was not in my lab, these tests were done, and this is really getting into it. How can you say it, George? A very involved kind of X-File kind of thing, because the lab was then seized by the feds. And this is when I was in Germany, and they tried to keep it secret, but it made the front page of the Vancouver Sun newspapers.
They seized it?
They seized the lab. It was destined for Germany, paid for by Germany and Austria. And all the shipping and packing and the crates and that of everything. But, however, unfortunately, the Canadian government literally walked over a BC Supreme Court order and took the lab. And tried to actually hide it under the Alex Fraser Bridge, but trying to be very secretive about it. But the newspapers found out about the whole thing and presented it on front page news.
The next thing I'd like to talk about as evidence for anti-gravity effects and use of anti-gravity techniques, if you will, is somewhere called Coral Castle. Now, my question is, could this have been built using anti-gravity methods? And now, Coral Castle is a tourist attraction in Florida. And its history is reasonably well known. In fact, it's very well known, I'd say, as far as to say that. And it was built single-handedly by a Latvian immigrant who was called Edward Lead Skalnin. Some of the blocks at Coral Castle weigh 30 tons, yet he seemed to have moved them without any heavy lifting equipment. This was done in the 1920s, in the 1930s. And the statements he made and the equipment at the site suggest that he may have used anti-gravity techniques to construct it. And you know, there's a real story behind this. It's a very interesting story. Now, the idea of him using anti-gravity techniques is not taken seriously at all, despite the difficulties in explaining the structures any other way. Well, they say, well, he just used a crane, or he just used leverage of blocks and one over the other, and it just doesn't add up. I mean, he may have moved some of the blocks on rollers and this sort of thing, but if you actually look at the place and look at how it's built, and you look at the way that it was built, there's no way he could have done it without using some other technique. And so here's a video clip to tell you a little bit more about Coral Castle.
I'm Todd Tongan, and tonight the 10 Taxi heads to Homestead and the Coral Castle. This South Florida tourist attraction not only wows visitors, but some age-old documents may provide some clues to a more efficient alternative energy source. The story's just ahead.
The 10 Taxi is back from vacation, and he actually, Todd Tongan that is, found a South Florida man who is studying the Coral Castle in South Miami-Dade, but not for the reasons you might think.
Todd Tongan took a trip to the castle today, and he's live in Miami with more. And Todd, what does this man hope to find out?
Well, a lot of things, actually. He's hoping to find out, first of all, how he built the Coral Castle, which is still a mystery, but also the man that built it studied some very interesting and unusual things. The 10 Taxi's a real gas guzzler, so anytime you're talking about a more efficient alternative energy source, we're interested. Homestead's Coral Castle is an engineering marvel that has been compared to Stonehenge and the Great Pyramids of Egypt. The 80-year-old castle took over 25 years to build, and all of it, all 1,100 tons of coral rock, was carved and created by one small man. Edward Leedskalnin was a Latvian immigrant who built it as a monument to lost love, and he built it in complete secrecy. So how did just one man move all this coral rock by himself? Well, for modern-day engineers, it's still somewhat of a mystery, but one South Florida man thinks this door to the past could unlock an alternative energy source for the future. When Edward Leedskalnin died, they found many of the tools he invented to build Coral Castle, but they also found copper wire, rudimentary generators, and assorted writings from the genius. You see, he was fascinated with the study of electromagnetic energy. Carlos Doles has spent the last 10 years studying and experimenting with Leedskalnin's theories. He even reproduced one of the genius's inventions.
This device he called the perpetual motion holder. Essentially, this is a large electromagnet.
Now, an electromagnetic generator is nothing new today, but 80 years ago it was quite innovative. And even today, Leedskalnin's device is considered a very unique design. By placing the coil on the radius of the wheel instead of the hub, he created faster RPMs, and in turn, more power. History's mystery of the Coral Castle may never be solved, but thanks to the man that built it, you never know. A future energy crisis could be. Now, Mr. Doles thinks that maybe Leedskalnin even used magnets to move some of that coral rock. Just how, he's not sure. As far as that generator is concerned, it could be used in a wind generator almost immediately. And so far, there are no patents on file that look anything like Leedskalnin's invention. Interesting. Todd Tongan, Channel 10, Eyewitness News.
Can you say money? It's king for that guy, huh? If it works anyway.
So I think there's some reasonably good evidence there that things went on at Coral Castle which other people would say were just, never happened. So the next place to look for evidence of anti-gravity technology being a reality is in black projects. And stories about this have been around for years, as you know. So let's have a look at some of the people who are involved. Over the last 50 years, there have been repeated stories and claims that the US has developed advanced craft which seem to mimic some of the behaviour of the craft flown by the people topside, as I like to call them. People like Bob Lazar are fairly well known in the field for these claims. While Stanton Friedman does not believe Lazar's claims, it is interesting to hear Boyd Bushman's opinion, and I'll play that in a moment. Bushman actually does give Lazar some credit.
Barry and I worked closely together. Now, this is also the first time that my supervisor left me alone with Barry, and this is where the learning process essentially began. These craft are extraterrestrial. The scope, the aim of our project is now to back engineer these craft, or this one particular craft, with the intention of duplicating it, or duplicating the subsystems within it, using earthly materials. So that was the project.
Were you told that you were going to be working on one specific area of back engineering, or were you going
only?
Only?
Yes,
Really, only?
Power and propulsion system, and everything else is essentially off limits.
Meaning you couldn't even touch it?
No, couldn't touch it. However, I did get to go on the craft one time, and this was for the express purpose of only seeing the placement of the reactor and how the gravity amplifiers worked, how the emitters moved freely underneath on the primary level, and just how all the subcomponents fit together. In the room, this is a lab off the main hallway, and in the room is one of the reactors from one of the crafts and one of the amplifiers from one of the crafts also.
How big are these?
The reactor, I would imagine, is about 2 feet, somewhere between 18 inches, 2 feet, somewhere in that general area. Odd-looking thing. Has a bottom plate and then half of a sphere on top of it. The amplifier itself is about 2 feet in diameter, probably 4 feet long, cylindrical shaped, with something that would look like plates on the outside of it, black in color. These are very unusual, and essentially hollow, very, very unusual looking devices. This isn't actually the amplifier that I always catch myself calling it that. It's the emitter. It's the device that is moved on a pivot, and it's where the gravity wave actually is or emanates from. Quite similar to a horn on a microwave system.
Did collectively investigate everything that Bob Lazar went, but not by calling Bob or going through the process. I'm accustomed on the inside of the military that with the high levels of security that I've had, of realizing at least every time we were doing an investigation that we knew would be top secret or above, we always had what we called the story, which is what we were really doing, and then we had the cover story, which was in the event that anyone talked to us, what could we tell? What could we tell them that we were doing? And Bob Lazar's stuff fits beautifully as a cover story. As a story, it stinks, but as a cover story, it's fantastic. And they indeed, the items that we identified by independent investigation were that his description regarding his work assignment was absolutely proper. That they allowed to be part of the cover story because they knew that we would be able to verify that. His description regarding element 115 being a potentially stable element was allowed to be part of the cover story. And there turns out to be a zone around 115 that we've known for years, 50 years at least, that there is a stable plateau that points down to the large elements. And about 114 to 118 is good. And it was interesting to me that as soon as Bob Lazar did his thing, in order to have a new element, you have to spend about $6 million, I should say, $6 billion to $1 billion. And as at the when Bob Lazar leaked his information, or I should say, gave the cover story for his information, we only had on the chemical chart element 109. Because people had positive enough reaction to Bob's stuff, the political people permitted a great deal of money to be expended in the United States, and they also gave a great deal, and I'm talking about larger than billions of dollars, to the CERN collider as well as on into Russia. Between Russia, CERN, and us, we now have on your periodic tables up to element 118. Now it's interesting to me that they said that they got something around 118 to 116 to be semi-stable, and but in the not the chemical chart, but in the physics chart of elements, you'll find that there are whole batches of isotopes. I suspect that the individuals found there to be several isotopes which are stable and usable, and I would suspect that they're probably busy with stable isotopes today, conducting further experiments, which are obviously not going to be released, because that's part of this story, not the cover story. The cover story is released, not the story.
Absolutely. Well, it's always good to hear some reinforcing evidence for the Lazar story. That's one of the classics for not only anti-gravity.
Bob acted perfectly proper for a person that is working on a cover story. I've had to use cover stories many times in my life as well, and noticed that he had no contact with anyone that has, or the standard UFO people. There are plenty of people that have published books about contacting Captain so-and-so as he brought his UFO across the sky. And all of those things exist. Bob Lazar contacted none of them. I think that they were fishing to try to get some of us to add some more understanding to their information, breaking through to the story. But I nor any of my friends decided to give them a call. And you understood, Sand, who the great them are.
Yeah, well, to switch...
They're also supporting Bob quite well, by the way. They made it so his reputation is kind of lousy, but very frankly, he's eating quite well.
Yeah.
That would also be within what I call a cover story period.
Another person who has talked about anti-gravity craft being reality is Disclosure Project witness Mark McCandlish. He testifies to knowledge of ARVs through his friend Brad Sorensen, who has seen these vehicles displayed at a secret air show which took place, I believe, in the early 1990s at an Air Force base. Perhaps less well known is a chap called Edgar Fouché. He had a top-secret crypto clearance and worked as an engineering program manager and site manager for the US Department of Defense contractors involved in classified development between 1987 and 1995. So this is much more recent sort of stuff. Okay. Now, a lot of people have tried to debunk all these claims for various reasons, but you have to look into them carefully and come to your own opinion. I believe Fuchs to be genuine. You can make your own judgment when you see the video clip. Fuchs appears to have some fairly detailed information, which he has given out in a number of lectures that he's given and in his book in a fictionalized form, which is called Alien Rapture. He spoke to a number of people involved in black projects, including people who piloted the SR-71. Fouché described a story of secretly being driven to an unknown desert location to work on crypto equipment in which he was an expert. That was his field of expertise. But he knew that this was somewhere near Groom Lake, where secret aircraft such as the F-117 stealth fighter were being tested. And you can see that in itself is triangular shaped. He states that in the late 1970s, when he had to fix some equipment, he came across and inspecting a module. This was like in a rack of equipment that he was inspecting when he had to take out this cryptographic equipment to fix it. He inspected a module called Direct Orbital Code Link, which contained advanced electronics. The meaning of this was confirmed in later conversations about satellite communications. I think they were described as DCL. He also stated that he overheard conversations while working there about something called quasi-crystals, which were an enabling technology for advanced communications and propulsion. Now, when you hear a term like that in a book, you think, well, that just sounds a bit too much like Star Trek. Somebody's just making that up. Well, fortunately with the internet, you can research these things easily. And quasi-crystals exist. Okay? Here we have a page from the California Institute of Technology about quasi-crystals and some information. So they do exist. This is not just made up nonsense. This exists. It's real. Okay? Edgar Fouché talks of even more advanced aircraft. He states that they have a number of these craft. Even though the full specifications of the 30-year-old SR-71 are still classified, it is known that it could fly at 85,000 feet at speeds of up to Mach 3.3. And this is 30 years ago, remember. The USAF now reportedly has the SR-75, which can travel up to 120,000 feet and Mach 5. And this will fly from Nevada to Russia in 3 hours. This was part of Project Aurora, which we'll hear a little bit more about shortly. Fouché describes SR-75 as a launcher for the SR-74, which can reach a height of 151 miles. In other words, it can basically go into orbit. The SR-75 can also launch a 2-ton satellite payload. So it's a launching platform as well, which gives the military a secret way of launching satellites, which is exactly the sort of thing they would like to do, I'm sure. Fouché describes the space shuttle as an antique, which I would also agree with. He also describes 2 other orbital vehicles, the Space Orbital Nuclear and the Service Intercept Vehicle, which is the SONCIV, or codenamed Locust. So he describes a whole range of these things. He's got some fairly detailed knowledge.
Do you know whether Aurora exists?
I have not. It has not been verified to me through legitimate channels that the Aurora exists, and thus, if it does exist, I have not been able to find out the information about the project that I would need to know as chairman of the Space Subcommittee that would enable me to see that technologies that were developed for the Aurora could be part of our calculations as to how much should go into the budget, into our space budget.
You wrote to President Clinton requesting declassification of the black budget.
And the only word back that I received from the President was a letter acknowledging my letter, and we haven't received a letter answering my specific request about releasing information about black programs, especially about Aurora, if it exists.
Are you yourself a believer in Aurora?
Well, if I had to bet the mortgage, I would probably come down on the side of saying there is an Aurora, that there's something out there that was developed in the latter years of the Cold War that uses some kind of a scramjet or ramjet that goes to 6 to 8 times the speed of sound and probably unmanned, made with the latest materials and technology and engines and craft. I would think that there is, because there's been too many sightings and too many people who are reliable sources that what they've seen is inexplicable except for that.
So here we have a look at the TR-3B, which is one of the craft that Edgar Fouché describes. He describes how he's seen photographs of a triangular-shaped craft called the TR-3B, taken by someone who was giving mission support on a C-130. The TR-3B is thought to be part of the Aurora, that's the Advanced Aircraft Development Program. One of Fouché's associates states he saw the TR-3B at Papoose, which is part of Area 51. It hovered silently in the same position for some 10 minutes before gently settling vertically on the tarmac. At times, a corona of silver-blue light glowed around the circumference of the massive TR-3B. The operational model is said to be 600 feet across, which is huge. I mean, that's bigger than any other aircraft that I can think of. In fact, it must be the biggest aircraft. Fouché states that at least 3 of the billion-dollar-plus TR-3Bs were flying by 1994. The craft can travel up to Mach 9 in any direction due to reduced G-forces, and Fouché describes how this thing actually works. The TR-3B's outer coating is reactive and changes with radar stimulation and can change reflectiveness, radar absorptiveness and colour. Quasi-crystals are used in the vehicle's skin. Fouché describes part of the propulsion as being by magnetic field disruption, which has been reversed engineered basically from ET technology. It uses a mercury-based plasma which is pressurized at 250,000 atmospheres and at a temperature of 150 Kelvin, which is minus 123 degrees centigrade, and this is spun with a speed of 50,000 revolutions per minute. This has the effect of reducing the weight of the centre of the craft by 89%, and this increases the manoeuvrability by 89% as well. Fouché states that MFD research, that's magnetic field disruption research, started as early as 1955. The TR-3B also uses nuclear thermal, hydrogen, oxygen engines for manoeuvring. And we'll mention this again later.
But Edgar Fouché's credentials as an Air Force avionics specialist do qualify him with the exact sort of background to have been assigned to Area 51.
I was there to repair and do a couple of modifications. And I went up every day at 4:30 in the morning before sunlight, came back every night after dark, and did this for 10 days straight.
There are rumors that the Aurora project is responsible for many UFO sightings in the vicinity of Area 51. Ball-shaped craft and strange hovering lights. There are those who believe that Aurora has produced a revolutionary breakthrough in advanced technology. Edgar Fouché thinks he knows what it is.
To me, the most fascinating vehicle from the Aurora program has been the TR-3B. It's a triangular-shaped vehicle. It uses a circular accelerator, as you imagine a circle within a triangle, that rotates a mercury-based plasma at 60,000 revolutions per minute, pressurized at 250,000 atmospheres, and supercooled to 150 degrees Kelvin. I absolutely believe that all the triangular-shaped vehicles that have been spotted belong to the U.S. government. The only thing that could outmaneuver a TR-3B would be the things we copied it from, which would be alien vehicles.
There is no evidence that his TR-3B aircraft exists. Except that in recent years unidentified triangular craft with a pulsating light in the center have been seen in various locations around the world.
You have my word, whatever it's worth, that I trust my friends. I believe what I've seen, what they've seen and told me. And I believe this technology exists. I'm absolutely convinced.
And Fouché describes that this name, TR-3B, is in the range. There's a TR-3A, which is actually a conventional-looking aircraft. And he says that they've used this TR-3B to disguise the fact that it's a classified vehicle. It's to throw people off the scent. Now, let's have a look and see if we've had any... If this thing exists, as Fouché maintains that it does, and it flies, then there is, of course, the possibility that people have actually seen it. And many of you will have heard of the flying triangles. And so we've already seen in the footage with Edgar Fouché a possible set of sightings of the TR-3B or something like it. And here's another one, which was in 2002.
There is very little clear recorded video or photographic evidence, apart of course from the Belgian incident in 1990. This footage is claimed to be a UFO triangle, but could it just be an aircraft? There is, however, something unusual about its flight path. We can see strong flashing lights and a triangular pattern. The original soundtrack is running, but there is no aircraft or helicopter sound. We can see the object moving behind trees from right to left. But watch. The object stops in mid-flight or turns very sharply and returns left to right. So what is it?
Okay, so the next section I'd like to look at is possible hints of new technology which appear to have come out of NASA. One of the things which happened last year on 28th of March 2004, NASA announced a successful test flight of a ramjet or scramjet engine which propelled the vehicle to Mach 7. And I think this has even been superseded to, I think, Mach 8 or Mach 9 this year, 2005. Though this isn't an anti-gravity device or propulsion engine, it does make me wonder what is still classified. I mean, this is a pretty advanced type of jet engine, but some people say this is 30-year-old technology. So what have they been working on since? The other thing which people seem to reject is the idea of a link between gravity and magnetism. Now, in the physics that I was taught, there was no real relationship between gravity and magnetism as such. But a recent NASA science story, which came out just over a year, well, nearly a year ago, talks about a new probe to test for gravitomagnetism. And here's the story. And this is the Gravity Probe B, which has left the Earth to measure a subtle yet long-sought force of nature, it says here. And this was a probe which was launched on April 20, 2004 to try and find this supposed link between gravity and magnetism, to find out the curvature of space-time, whether it can be affected by magnetism and this sort of thing. The next thing I'd like to talk about is the hints of new technologies which were released right under our noses. in February 2004.
I recall in your study one of the things, and you hinted at it, of an enabling technology for the Mars mission was this nuclear thermal propulsion.
Yes, sir.
And it seemed like I recalled, and you said something about 240 days if you do chemical and 100 days or less if you do nuclear thermal propulsion. And the other piece of that was the significant savings in cost to do the mission. Billions of dollars, as I recall from that study. Do I recall correctly?
You're correct. And the fact for those, you can take a look at these curves. Those are all verified. Those are all run by JPL for us over a period of 6 months, simulation and modeling. And the darker ones, the blue ones, are the nuclear thermal. And with just a slight increase in mass down there on the nuclear thermal, you can cut the transit time from 240 days even down to 130. Mm-hmm. And then if you have any electrical power propulsion, there for ion propulsion, you can really cut it down to about 60 days. Now this drastically reduces your gross liftoff weight, which directly relates to cost and staging and everything else, Mr. Chairman. Mm-hmm. And yes.
Okay. It's interesting, just an observation. Anytime this country, and I know this in DOD, and you do as well, wants something really badly and fast, we take it out of the normal acquisition cycle.
Yes, sir.
We specialize, and it says something about the acquisition system. Means if we don't want something fast and needed, we'll put it in there. You know, so it's a little bit. It's kind of backwards. It sounds like.
In the video there, he mentioned nuclear thermal propulsion. But Edgar Fouché spoke of nuclear thermal propulsion in 1998, which is when he gave his talks in which he described the TR-3B. So something's going on here. And there's some further comments which came from the Moon to Mars briefings as well, which I found quite interesting.
One observation, one question. I'm struck by your list of supporting technologies as I look at it. I put my previous hat on, responsible for all the Air Force research and development and technology, including the space stuff. With the exception of the EVA suit, everything that you list there are technologies that other agencies, in this case particularly the Air Force, are developing to some extent or another. And I think it reinforces that notion for leveraging technologies and leveraging agencies to make sure they're working together, because every one of these in some form or another is being touched upon, and there are dollars associated with it, and from the Air Force and I'm sure many other organizations also. So that leveraging aspect is very, very important. The question, you talked about management and NASA management, et cetera, and you mentioned a couple of different areas. I don't know if you've had a chance to look at, but I'd be interested, or the Commissioner would be very interested, if you could give us your comments, if not today, but in the future, about the reorganization NASA is currently making within the headquarters to address some of the things that you talked about. Thinking particularly of Code T, their new exploratory systems, sort of a Air Force Systems Command-like organization to be responsible for addressing some of the concerns that you've expressed in your study. So if you haven't had a chance to look at it and give us your thoughts today, certainly would be interested in when you can get back to us.
Well, General Lyles, what I'd like to do is to come back with you. I know just briefly, and I'm all in favor that they have Admiral Craig Steidle, who has got a lot of acquisition experience. He's bringing people in there with him, and we're more like the CODEM writes the requirements, and the other people who do the acquisition development, just like the Systems Command did. I think it's a wonderful way to go, but I only know just some of the primary details, and I'd be glad to look into it and come back and report to the Commission. I think it's but also this National Program Office I mentioned would pull all together, because the Air Force does have a lot of technology.
Thanks, Tom.
And the quote there was, the Air Force does have a lot of technology. And that was what Tom Stafford actually said in that clip. So what's the Air Force doing developing technology to go into space? I thought that was NASA's job. Now, interlinked with all this is the idea of free energy devices, energy that can be extracted from the vacuum, zero-point energy, or ether energy as it's sometimes called. Nick Cook has described how anti-gravity effects and the zero-point field seem to be interwoven, so one affects the other and one can come out of the other. He has therefore continued to investigate free energy devices. And Nick Cook spoke to Art Bell on the US Coast to Coast show on the 14th of March 2004. And here is that clip of him explaining his thoughts.
In my experience, there are people who are now producing small but usable amounts of energy from the vacuum of space.
Give me some examples. What have you seen?
Well, there is an individual who doesn't want to step out of the limelight quite yet, but who is in America and who has developed a device which, to my satisfaction, is producing small but usable amounts of energy from.
Tell me everything you know about the device. I mean, did you get to see it? Did you get a demonstration? Did you get to examine the device? Tell me what you know.
I haven't seen the device yet, but we have talked about it at length. I have sent emissaries to go and look at people I know who are scientists to go and look at the device, and they came back to me and said, this is real. It is producing usable amounts of energy, and so at the earliest opportunity, I'm going to go out and see this guy. I mean, unfortunately, there is, there have been huge demands on my time since publication of the book, and a lot of people stepped forward making these claims. So I have to be very careful about, if
all
I
right, well,
you've got
to be careful about the whole thing, Nick. But tell me if you know, if you sent a scientist, what did this scientist come back and tell you about the energy that it used to get started, or did it keep going perpetually? Or give me some idea of what we're talking about.
This particular device requires a small energy input to get started.
Okay.
But once it is up and running, it's a solid-state device, and once it is up and running, it continues to churn out small levels of energy of the order of several hundred watts.
Oh.
But it is deemed to be scalable, and in time, the inventor predicts that increasing levels of output will be there. So, and what this tells me is that this is a reflection of many other claims out there, that there are devices which tap into the zero-point energy field. Now, as I say, I haven't had an opportunity to look into many beyond this one, but
that's all right. I want to know as much as I can about this one. For example, are there moving parts? Is there a magnetic field in motion involved in it?
No, it's a solid-state device.
I'll be darned.
So it literally sits there and interacts with the zero-point field to produce its energy output. And now the guy actually, he has several other inventions which utilize other methods, including rotating magnetic fields for energy extraction. But it's this particular one that he's concentrating on, and I think which seems to offer the most promise.
Well, that's incredible. Even Nick, at the level of several hundred watts, I thought you were going to be talking about milliwatts or less.
No,
several hundred watts, that's the real McCoy, Nick, and you've sent somebody of substantial scientific background who really got an opportunity. Did he tell you he had a full opportunity to examine the apparatus?
Absolutely. Was there for several days and looked into it in some depth, and it satisfied, to his understanding, the criteria for a workable device.
That's incredibly exciting. If something like that really exists, all kinds of things are possible. Nick, like this man's, I would think his life might be in danger.
Well, I don't know. You hear these claims. Personally, I don't subscribe to these views. I'm a kind of touchy-feely kind of guy who needs to go out there and see these things for myself. And when I finally get to examine this piece of kit with my own eyes and see that it works for real, then that's the day that I'm really going to believe it. But as I say, it does show promise, and it intrigues me sufficiently, getting these responses back from people that I trust, that what we're looking at here is something real.
So, having seen this evidence that I've put together here, if there's something in all this, then why the secrecy? Why is it being kept secret? Well, it means free energy for everyone. No roads. We don't need any roads. We don't need fossil fuel because we can extract energy from the 0-point field. We can move things without worrying about gravity. So maybe it's all just a dream.
I think we're really on the cusp of a whole new era in science and understanding. And if nothing else, that's what I'd like this book to do, is to get these principles to be debated openly without fear of ridicule.
So I'd like to sum up the case for anti-gravity. And here's a few points for the prosecution and the defence which we can pull out of the air. The prosecution might say there is no proof that it is possible to influence the force of gravity and change the weight of something, which is what I'm basically talking about. Now, I would argue that simple experiments can be demonstrated which appear to show the weight reduction is possible. And this is what the Frollov's hat experiment shows and the lifter footage shows. I would argue that's pretty good experimental evidence for it being a real effect. You can actually do this. And how was Coral Castle built? Let's have an explanation from somebody who just doesn't have some kind of hand-waving explanation as to how this diminutive man can have built these huge structures with these huge blocks virtually in secret. The prosecution might say that all aircraft that are ever seen use only known and well-proven technologies such as jet engines. And as we know, many witnesses describe craft which seem to operate on some advanced form of propulsion, and a number of these craft have been photographed and filmed. And I needn't really dwell on that point, because there is so much footage now that it's just getting beyond a joke. The prosecution might say it is not possible to prove that the photographs and videos are not the result of faking. Well, of course not. But we have the FT, the Flying Triangle, which was filmed over St. Petersburg in 1997, and that was videotaped by 3 separate witnesses. So that's getting a pretty good level of corroboration in my book. There's been no retrieval of crashed ET vehicles or re-engineering of technology, and that is just the skeptic's view. But against that, we have a number of witnesses who have come forward who describe retrieving crashed craft and different witnesses working on black projects to re-engineer technology in them. Other witnesses testify to the reality of ET-related black projects, which is what the opening video clip of John Maynard showed you. And we have people like David Adair and Bob Lazar, who I've mentioned. I didn't mention David Adair earlier on, who have worked on these projects. Nuclear thermal propulsion is a fantasy. Somebody in the prosecution might say, well, actually, that is not correct. Nuclear thermal propulsion was developed in the 1970s, and it was called the NERVA program, the Nuclear Electric Rocket Vehicle Assembly program, I think, or I can't remember the exact acronym. And it has publicly been proposed as a possible technology for future Mars missions in the video clips you've seen in this presentation. Flying triangles are illusions or the result of mistaken identity of one kind or another. There is no conclusive proof they actually exist. Many witnesses have seen FTs, and some have photographed them. Their configuration seems to me to match the supposed configuration of the TR-3B in some key respects, i.e. the shape and the central light and the 3 lights at the corner. So it's now up to you, the jury, to decide. And that's really brought us to the end of this presentation. But I'd like to close with a story about Thomas Townsend Brown. He once told his family that he made an analogy comparing a person and UFOs and ET craft to a fish looking up at the bottom of a passing ship. Townsend Brown said, "That fish looks up at that strange thing in his sky. It may have different properties, maybe size, prop wash or turbulence. Some fish will scatter and never look again. Some fish will wonder. But none of them will really know what that form represents. They will never know about what other things man, who is obviously sailing the ship, is capable of, other than sailing across that particular part of the ocean. We, in many ways, are those fish, and the lights we see in our skies are the hulls of those ships." And this is a list of the sources of information that I used for this presentation. Thank you very much for listening.